music, and then gradually becoming into it. In any case, long and short of it was that since when I was, people sometimes say, why did you come to Milwaukee? But as you may know, if you're an academic, you don't choose to go certain places. You go where a job may be. Marquette liked the look of me and they hired me. This was in the early days of Catholic schools hiring non-Catholics to theology faculties. And so it just so happens that the year that I was ordained priest, 1985, coincided with the year I started at Marquette, 1985. And so I've just been blessed to be able to combine the two ministries, because I see my classroom as a parish in a way, and the parish is a place where people are not just sort of recipients of my wisdom or whatever it is, but we're all in this quest together. All right, now does everyone have the page handout? The handout pages were back. Whatever you like. I have a few copies of a book that I'll be referring to, but I won't be referring to it much. It's really just so that you can take a look at it. It's a book called a Gospel Synopsis or Gospel Parallels that prints the Gospels in parallel columns. And so sometimes people haven't encountered it before, and I want to introduce people to it who haven't. But we're not going to be looking in detail at particular examples. I wish there were time, there isn't, for us to go around the room so that I could hear what each of you brings to this meeting in terms of background, knowledge, and so on, because I don't want to take things for granted. At the same time, I don't want to be rehashing things that you've heard many, many times. But I do hear every Sunday from Nancy about what the topics of the forum are, and so far as I've learned, there hasn't been something quite exactly on this topic for a while. Okay, all right. So this is the blurb I gave that you read something, and I take this bit. For many Christians in the US and around the world, how and when and in what order the Gospels were written are matters of indifference. The question wouldn't occur to many people, because many people aren't asking that kind of question. But we do have 4 Gospels. What are riches? You know, there was a movement in the early church in the 2nd and 3rd centuries to combine, not only to combine the Gospels into one, but in a sense to let the individual Gospels become obsolete. And so there are a number of early church Gospels. The main one is called the Diatessaron, and it's a Gospel reading that reads, it's a harmony, what we'd call a harmony of the Gospels. And it's a wonderful idea, but what genius of the church to keep separate Gospels that tell the same stories in different ways. An act of courage, really, because every minister is liable to be asked, well, how is it that Matthew has this and Mark has that? You know, wouldn't it be better just to kind of... And the scribes who copied the manuscripts, they sensed that tension, and often they would change the manuscript of Mark to make it like Matthew. Matthew in particular, he became the favorite Gospel. Anyway, others, especially those concerned to piece together a life of Jesus from the Gospel record, depend on such judgments. I spent a large part of my early career with a group called the Jesus Seminar. We used to meet periodically, about once every 3 months or so, usually in California, because that's where the organizers were. And we would systematically go through everything that Jesus said and everything that Jesus did. We would piece out assignments. You'd write essays on this story or that story, trying to summarize the best scholarship. And then we'd have a big, heated debate about it. And then we would take a vote. And a vote not to decide, is it true or is it not? That we were horribly misrepresented in the press, because the press loves to bash scholars who seem to be attacking sacred cows. We weren't. The idea was to make accessible to a general public not only the judgments of scholars that the scholars are making anyway, they're teaching in the universities, but also to show this is available, that you can do it. And so we not only had professionals like me who were part of this organization. And by the way, these were not invited to be part. You had to ask you simply say, can I come to the meeting? In other words, you show up if you wanted to be part of it. So it wasn't a kind of a hand-picked, we want all these liberals to get together. But anyway, so a lot of traditionalist scholars gave us a really, really hard time, even though they're teaching exactly the same things in their classrooms and in their textbooks, because it's almost as if this is something that the general public needn't know about. You know, keep it very quiet. So, others, I might just add, here I have a friend at Marquette who teaches, he's a Roman Catholic priest from Nigeria, who tells me that the kind of work that I and other New Testament scholars do would be of no interest whatsoever in his parish. Well, the parish is there generally, but these questions are just they don't provoke an interest. And I think the problem is that the payoff is not made clear enough. So, you know, you put all this energy, you learn Greek and you learn Hebrew and all that stuff, and then what do you have to show for it, you know? So, anyway, let's move on. The past century of gospel studies has increasingly turned our attention to the reasons for each gospel's composition. And one of the lovely things about the Episcopal Lectionary, the Revised Common Lectionary, is that in going from year A to B to C, and then we stick John in at various points along the way, is that the preacher, I think a gifted preacher can do this, you bring out, as you proceed through the year, what distinctly that evangelist for that year has to say. So, for example, my sermons this year are very much about what Matthew is trying to communicate. So Matthew is kind of the intermediary, the go-between, between the tradition and us as we listen to Matthew, just as we are to be go-betweens between the gospel that we hear and the world. So let's just do some, for orientation, where do we fit? Placing the New Testament in the Greco-Roman world. Generally, when I teach my 1001 Intro to Theology, I draw a picture of this, and that's the Mediterranean. And what we have to know is that Palestine is really where it all starts, but then it gradually spreads. And it spreads in the world that Alexander the Great had conquered. And the reason why the New Testament is written in Greek, and much of the discourse of the early church is in Greek, it doesn't become really Latin until the 2nd and 3rd centuries, is because Greek was the common language of everybody. And in fact, I brought my little, very, very small toolkit. The one essential thing is a Greek New Testament. You cannot do any work in the New Testament without the Greek New Testament, or as a second best, say at the undergraduate level, a good translation. And I'll talk about translations later. But you may want to pass this around. This is my most loved little Greek New Testament. So, placing the gospel in the New Testament. Now, one of the most important things we learn about any field, I think it's something you should learn as an undergraduate, is that the first job of a student is to learn how to classify things. What kind of thing is this? To what genre does it belong? Whether it's music or poetry or whatever. And that's especially the case, I think, in literature, where we have 4 distinct genres in the New Testament. And I'll make this brief because I know this isn't principally the subject matter of today, but it helps us kind of keep apples and oranges separate. 4 Gospels. Now, even if we don't know yet what Gospels are, and there's a huge debate about, are Gospels biographies? Are they, for many years, hundreds of years really, the Gospels were thought to be a unique, distinct genre that God had brought into being to fill the role of gospel. You know, so Gospels are Gospels, that's what they are. More and more they are being seen to be a species of Hellenistic biography. They are a kind of biography, and there are a number of criteria by which that's established. There's one Acts, the Acts of the Apostles, but even that is better described as theological history. It belongs alongside, let's say, the books of Deuteronomy, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Samuel, in narrating the works of God, so that God is the principal actor. And that's the thing. In the book of Acts, the principal actor is God. In fact, the Holy Spirit, you might say, becomes through Peter and Paul, principally. Thirdly, letters. And of course, we could dwell on the fact that why are there so many letters in the New Testament? Well, it says something about all the missionary activity that was going on back and forth when the church began. And then finally, one apocalypse. And I don't think it takes much thought to realize there really is only going to be room for one apocalypse in any body of literature, because you're going to have otherwise competing views of the end, and that's problematical. So what about the other Gospels? I'll just draw very briefly on the other Gospels. I think it's fair to say after all these years, even though I learned Coptic to read the Gospel of Thomas and other things, there isn't much that has a good case to be made for it as being authentic, going back to the original Jesus, but it does show the creativity of the tradition and the same impulse to develop, to explain, to harmonize that we see in the New Testament Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke especially, is what we see going on in the Gospel of Thomas. So the Gospel of Thomas is certainly worth studying, but I doubt it can be placed earlier than about 120, 130, that's into the 2nd century, about 50 years later than the other Gospels, although some scholars among my Jesus Seminar friends would place it as early as 40 or 50. And the chief reason for that, their chief reason, is that it seems to be what's called a sayings gospel. It only has sayings, 114 sayings. And so the argument is that that was before there emerged the pattern of a gospel being sayings, deeds, and passion narrative. And that's the sequence that you and I are familiar with, where the passion narrative becomes the goal. The Gospel of Thomas has no passion narrative. So it's just a collection of sayings, rather like a document we'll talk about in a moment called Q, the sayings source of New Testament. So how were the Gospels composed? Well, here's a basic picture. Where's my eraser? Oh, I see. Now, as I said earlier, for some people, and I want to sort of don't want to be doing it. Well, here's Jesus. Here's the starting point. And what I learned as an undergraduate, and I felt was confirmed as a graduate student, is that there is a period from Jesus of oral tradition. It was all by word of mouth. And the tradition was conveyed in various units of tradition. So miracle stories, parables, legal teaching, things, Jesus said this, Jesus said that. Dialogues emerge in response to various situations. So this period, which we can't fully recover, there's a series of books broadly on the topic from the oral to the written gospel. And folklore studies and other such studies have shown that a lot of transitions take place when you move from the spoken to the written word. We can't say laws exactly, but you can trace how traditions evolve, develop, whatever it is. And so there's this period of unknowing, the oral tradition. But broadly, these units of tradition seem to be floating around. And the reason we think that's the case is because you can find the same unit of tradition multiply attested in different places in slightly different forms. Maybe the same story occurs in one place as a parable, in another place as a miracle. The same tradition in that way. So at some point, we get the beginnings of a written tradition with these various forms. And these forms can be now isolated. So you can buy handbooks that classify all the kinds of sayings of Jesus. And as I give a list here, sayings, just individual sayings, pronouncements. And these are things that often, they don't require a particular context to make sense. So Jesus said, "I am the light of the world." You obviously don't require a particular context to make sense of that. But if you have a saying, Jesus said, "Arise, be healed, go on your way," well, we need a story for that, because that's a kind of clearly conclusion. And so scholars began to classify, taking as their models various Old Testament models, and as I say, folklore studies often from Eastern Europe, and began to classify these forms. And so one of the handbooks of people like me, who still believe in going back to the historical Jesus through the literary sources, and some don't, but I do, would be a book called The Formation of the Gospel Tradition Collecting, listing all the forms, and then giving examples of them. And you can trace them not only in the Gospels, but elsewhere. Dialogues with the disciples and miracle stories. The miracle story has a fascinating form. You can, once you, if you, it's a good for, my undergraduates love to make Excel spreadsheets out of miracle stories, because once you classify the various elements routinely the same form, there'll be a problem that the person has. He was a deaf man. So then we have sometimes a heightening statement. He'd been deaf all his life, never heard a word, something like that, you know. And then somehow he and the healer, in this case Jesus, get together. Someone brings the two together. The healer then says something or does something. And then, not surprisingly, there's some kind of proof that the cure has happened. He can now hear. And then at the end we have the reaction of the crowd. And that reaction is obviously like in a commercial, it's kind of serving suggestion. This is what the audience is supposed to think, or how they're supposed to react. And it's beautiful how predictable these are. But not only that, but if this form is a real form and did exist, as most of us in the field believe, you can also tell, once that oral tradition becomes a written tradition, how the author of a written tradition can then manipulate that form to make it say something slightly different. A great example of this is the changing of water into wine, which in many ways looks like a miracle story, but actually becomes something else at the end. It becomes what I, in my old-fashioned classification, would call a pronouncement story. It becomes a statement about who Jesus is. It's not marveling at a miracle, it's saying, hey, it's him, he's the man. And so stories are capable, once they get to be written, they're capable of manipulation in that way. So I want to address this question before we go any further, because I want to nail my flag to the mast. This is hotly disputed still. I like to think the matter's settled, but of course it isn't. And you should be aware, I said this to somebody else, I think right here, that scholarship is not, scholars are not quiet, peaceful students of tradition just passing it on from generation to generation. I mean, the disagreements run deep, and sometimes they're pretty bloody. There will be times, even in the Jesus Seminar, which was by and large a liberal group, there'd be fierce disputes about stuff. Even more so in the academy as a whole, where there are clear, if I say the word conservative and liberal, which is broadly the kind of the way things break down, some conservatives won't, well, they'll read what the liberals say, but they know they're not going to like it right from the start. And I can tell, if I buy a new book on the Gospels, I can read about 3 pages, and I know what the final outcome's going to be. And probably they can read my stuff, and they know what the outcome's. So, but I can, there is a lot of intransigence there. Sometimes it's even denominational. You can tell where the person is coming out of. And that's a pity, because we like to claim objectivity. But of course, there's no objectivity in the ultimate sense. We just aspire to make arguments that make sense. So that if you want to refute an argument, you have to use arguments that at least the other side understands. I speak somewhere here, I won't, yes, in that paragraph, the big word in academic scholarship of the New Testament is method. What is your method? You can't just open the New Testament and say, well, I think he said this, well, I think he said that. Why? Because often that amounts to personal preference. There are things that Jesus is said to have said that I wish he wasn't said to have said. And my judgment as to whether he said them or not has to do with my tracing of the tradition, not with my personal preference. When Jesus says, maybe, I think this is in the outline, one of the outlines, my draft maybe, where Jesus says of the Jews, you are of your father the devil, this kind of thing. Now, that appalls me that that's in the Gospel of John as attributed to Jesus. Fortunately, I think, from our modern study of the Gospel of John, once we understand the social context of John, we can see why the author would have attributed such a saying to Jesus. What he's really saying is, well, I don't have time to get into it, but the main thing is that the Gospel of John is a sectarian dispute between 2 different groups, both of whom consider themselves legitimate successors to the Judaism of Abraham. So it's much more, it's not a matter of some objective pronouncements. But I recognize that there's a whole band of Christians, probably the majority in the world, who think that if the Gospel of John or any Gospel says Jesus said X, then Jesus said it. And I don't really know how to get across that in any broad way, but I think it's pretty important that some attempt be made. I think it's the preacher's duty, especially in a country like this or anywhere in the West, where there is an openness, I think, to listen, to make clear so that my congregation at St. Simon's will know. I'll never flat out say Jesus didn't say this or didn't do that, but we'll be listening to say, what was Matthew's role in passing on this tradition, or John's role, whatever it might be. All right, we're getting to the point where then, just a couple more things. Inspiration. I'm not including, this is not a discussion about whether God inspired A, B, or C. I will say, though, that I remember a question that I was asked at my interview at Marquette, which was about this time of year in 1985. And the senior professor of systematic theology was interviewing me. And he said to me, well, tell me, Dr. Hills, what is your theology of inspiration? And I said, but I firmly believe this, that for me, the principal question is, what is the location of inspiration? That is, where does it take place? And for me, it's in the community, which is why what I'm most interested in when I'm studying the Gospels is, what was it like to be a Christian back there, when you were believed that the Holy Spirit was inspiring you to say and do certain things? And so it's the location of inspiration. So God still inspires, but I'm a little suspicious when an individual said, God inspired me to say X, but let's listen within the community as a whole to how God is moving us to say and do things on his behalf. So now, what I want to get then, what I want to get to now is now let's get to the question. What about these Gospels in what order? And I want to draw on the board a diagram which is, you know, in almost every field, there's a certain orthodoxy that even if you don't like it, it's your business to learn it to begin with, and then you may challenge it and so on. So this is we can learn a lot just by seeing what the tradition of scholarship has handed to us. All right. One more. This is the solution to the synoptic problem, the synoptics being Matthew, Mark, and Luke, called synoptic because they see together. They're seeing with the same eyes, opt and sin together. And the solution to the synoptic problem is that, well, I shouldn't say solution. The theory that has sustained scholarship for about 100 years. 1924, Bernard Hilmer Streeter wrote a book called The Synoptic Problem, in which he set this out in painstaking detail, comparing story after story, and came up with the probability that if we have these gospel sources, Mark, Matthew, and Matthew seems to have used a source. We don't know what it was, it doesn't survive, so we call it M. Q, now Q is what you get when you compare Matthew and Luke, which are very, very similar. They have a lot of stuff that comes from Mark. They also have a lot of stuff that comes from somewhere else, but we don't think they knew each other. So it must come from a now lost source, which we call Q, from a German word Quelle, meaning source. That's probably where it comes from. I like the theory that because Mark was said to have been the disciple of Peter, and in the late 19th century, Mark's principal source was thought to be Peter. It was abbreviated P, and the next source to be conjectured, therefore, was Q, because Q comes after P. But, you know, what's the problem? Nancy was sighing, you know, that spousely sigh. All right. Now, Matthew and Luke both have stuff that only they have. And Luke, therefore, has, we call Luke's stuff, and interestingly, a lot of Luke's unique stuff is parables. Luke has a great fondness of parables, including the two, what I like to throw out there as, but I don't name them. What are the two most loved parables of Jesus in the New Testament, in the Gospels? Pardon? Prodigal son. Good Samaritan. But only in Luke. And I think there's something about, they've dug their place, they've established their place in the culture, and so we owe them not just to Luke, but to this source L, which is now lost. And you might say, well, how do you think that's so? What you do is you collect all the stuff that Matthew and Luke don't have, and then you take the stuff that Matthew and Luke have, but there's a difference, because Luke has some different stuff. You take all the pieces that are left that we call L, and then you line them up. Yes, Steve. Oh, I'm sorry. Thank you, Steve. Yes, absolutely. Thank you. What's that? Oh, I should repeat the question. Did Q also influence Luke? Yes, in my rush to draw the story, I left out that arrow. The arrow means that these were sources of, or fed into. Now, let's just see. I have clearly privileged, as they like to say, this order of things by taking Mark, but this is based on judgments, of course. So we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 6 sources. As I'm not a mathematician, but textbooks do this commonly. They say if you've got 6 different sources, they could be reconfigured in a variety of ways. Even Matthew, Mark, and Luke, you could turn them around. So it could be Matthew, then Mark, then Luke. It could be Mark, then Matthew, then Luke. It could be Mark, then Luke, then... You see what I'm saying? But this is what is generally... This is where you start. Now, there is a growing body of opinion, because scholars don't like to just inherit and adopt the consensus, that there's a growing body of opinion that, in fact, Q never existed. And therefore, we've used it as a crutch to deal with those passages that Matthew and Luke share, they didn't get from Mark. There's a major scholar on the East Coast who holds that Markan priority, which is what a lot of this rests on. This is commonly called the two-source hypothesis, Mark and Q. That Mark was not the first, that Mark is in fact a summary or an abbreviation. And these days, a lot of resources are being spent on creating computer programs that can somehow receive and synthesize all the evidence using computer models. I haven't done any of that kind of work. What I do, and what I was taught to do, and I can show you one example from this book called The Gospel Synopsis, which lines up Matthew, Mark, and Luke in parallel columns, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. But even here, I have to admit, this book is printed on the presumption, well, it's on the working hypothesis that Mark was original, the first, because Mark is in the middle, and then you compare Matthew on the left and Luke on the right. So there's a kind of, you're leaning on the reader a little. In the 1960s, a scholar, William Farmer, produced a synopsis based on Matthew. He said, what if we take Matthew to be the earliest gospel and put Matthew in the middle? And it does look different. In fact, he even was able to persuade Oxford University Press to do a full printed version. I'll just show you one example here, a couple anyway. This is, well, it's very faint now. It's faded over the years. I have a Greek New Testament, a Greek synopsis at home. What we're encouraged to do as graduate students is to go through the old-fashioned way with colored pencils, colored crayons, and underline agreements and disagreements. So, for example, if it's in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, it would all be green, underlined. If it's in Matthew only, it's red. If it's Mark, so on and so forth. You develop a code. And it's amazing, after you've done a few pages of that, how you can come to predict who agrees with what and who disagrees with it. You get a sense, and I don't know if you noticed, there were 2 different versions of the title of this talk. One was the 4 Gospels, who came first, and the other version, the 4 Gospels, which came first. But what emerges from this is the sense of a person, that these are people who are making choices. These are not just kind of mechanical decisions. Which brings us to the question briefly, I won't stick with this because we have other stuff to do, but the question of authorial intention. To what extent does it matter that Matthew, Mark, or Luke intended to do this or that or the other? Now, to me, it's self-evident that if we see a text in Matthew and a text in Mark, they clearly are the same story, and somebody has copied from somebody else, and there's a difference. I take it that the changed one, whichever it is, There was a change for a reason, and that reason I take to be an intention. Others would say, you may have heard of this, the intentionalist fallacy, whereby you kind of psychologize and you suddenly start inventing this author who never really existed, and so you are then, there is a way of dealing with this though, and that is a modern kind of criticism called reader response criticism, which is not so much asking what did the author intend to say, but how is the reader being encouraged to understand the story? So you're kind of more internalizing the effects of what the changes are. Nevertheless, I believe it's possible to write, and it has been done, a redactional history of Matthew. So you can show how Matthew has systematically taken word by word, phrase by phrase from Mark, and has reorganized it, and then you can begin to collect reasons. And those reasons would be things like a developing church hierarchy. I was just mentioning last night to Nancy, we're talking about good examples of things. In Mark, there is the story, I'm sure you remember it, where James and John go to Jesus and say, Master, we'd like a favor. When you come into your kingdom, would you please grant us to sit one on your right and one on your left? And Jesus, of course, puts him down and God, what are you asking? You shouldn't be asking for this. In any case, he says, it's not mine to give. When Matthew gets hold of that story and retells it, Matthew doesn't have the two brothers ask Jesus, because by the time Matthew's written, according to this kind of chronological picture, the church is beginning to emerge as a place where the apostles have a kind of status. And you don't want to do anything to make the apostles look bad. And so, some of you may remember this, in Matthew, it's not James and John who go up to Jesus and make the request, it's their mother. The mother of James and John goes up to Jesus, hey, Master, I'd like you to do something for my boys here, you know. But this is true, and you begin to see that that's what Matthew's up to. Matthew will try to protect Peter. In Matthew, Peter is suddenly elevated so that he can walk on the water, at least for a little bit, before he loses his faith. Matthew has a whole developed church organization. If your brother sins against you, this is what you're going to do. You're going to go with a couple of other disciples and other members of the church, and you try and reprove your brother. And if he won't listen, you take more. And otherwise, if he still won't listen, you cast him out. Now, that's a kind of big emerging discipline system, which isn't there in Mark. Luke, we don't know how much discipline Luke knew. He may just not have been very interested in that kind of subject matter. Nancy, were you going to do something with the microphone?
Yeah, when you were going back a little bit, I wanted to see if I understood this correctly, that with M and L and Q, those are all implied sources because no one has ever seen anything from those things?
Yes, they are hypothetical sources. And what it depends on, the reconstruction of L. Now, L would be stuff from that synopsis book that doesn't have any parallel in Matthew, Mark, or Luke, in Matthew or Mark. So L is what's left over once you've deleted the stuff that came from Mark and the stuff that came from Q, but it's not in Matthew. So the key test for me is, if you collect these things, including those two parables I mentioned, is there a personality to that hypothetical document? Could you reconstruct it? And people do. People even write dissertations on it. And by the way, I don't think I said this, and I meant to. This theory of relationships is still sufficiently orthodox as a scholarly reconstruction that you can, and my students still do, begin a dissertation by saying, I presuppose the two-source hypothesis. In other words, you don't have to spend the first 100 pages arguing for this. At the same time, if you are one of the emerging people who want to try and dispute this in some way, typically by making Matthew the first, which is, by the way, what St. Augustine believed, and Matthew became by far the most popular gospel in the early church, then you would say, I acknowledge what the two-source hypothesis is, but the purpose of my work, or part of the purpose of my work, is to challenge this theory. But this is where you need to start. I use as an analogy music. I grew up with tonality. I understand key, harmony, the way that things work in relation to each other. But I recognize that there are composers who are light years ahead of me who don't think of tonality anymore. They're beyond that. They're kind of atonal. I can't get there in my head, but that's my failing. I'm just not capable of it. Similarly, I admire those scholars who will brave the waters in stepping outside of this. It's really quite formidable, the number of, the amount of scholarship that seems to support this understanding of things. And what we learn about, principally we learn about Matthew and Luke and the development of the tradition by studying them in relation to Mark. The real problem we face is actually a text critical one, that is the basis of the text itself. Because the scribes who copied all the Gospels, they had a tendency, and you can see it's well-intentioned, to want to harmonize the Gospels with one another, to make them more similar, especially to harmonize with Matthew. Because Matthew, being the most churchy Gospel, you could run a church on Matthew. You probably couldn't on Mark, you need other stuff. But Matthew was so beautifully arranged. I mean, 5 principal discourses, how to run a mission, how to deal with penitence, how to receive missionaries back again, what you should say about the end of the world. Matthew has this final discourse about the sheep and the goats and all that. So Matthew is a kind of catechetical gospel, and it's often described in that sort of way. Mark's is not that. Mark's is a passion, as has been described for more than 100 years. Mark is a passion narrative preceded by a long introduction. So the whole of Mark is building up to that. Yes?
Has the discovery of the content from the Dead Sea Scrolls, which is thought to be original, very close to original material, impacted this analysis at all?
It has impacted it chiefly in one way, that at the time the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered, in the late 40s, mid to late 40s, there was a tendency for people to try and more to bring the Gospels into the Greek world. What the Dead Sea Scrolls showed was that the language, the idiom of the New Testament also had a great deal in common with the Dead Sea Scrolls, which of course are very Jewish. And so the Jewish Jesus has gradually become more and more into the fore. In fact, we're discovering a fuller picture of Hellenistic Judaism, thanks in large part to our discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls. The great thing about, as you may know, about the Dead Sea Scrolls is that because they were preserved untouched for 1,000 years, they've shown us the enormous faithfulness of the Hebrew text from then until now. In fact, until they were discovered, the earliest Hebrew manuscripts we had of the Old Testament dated from the Middle Ages, like the year 1000. The Dead Sea Scrolls, those manuscripts were copied, let's say in the year 100 AD, some earlier than that. It's amazing how correct, how true were the medieval manuscripts to the manuscripts we have from, say, the year 100. In other words, that scribal tradition was unbelievably faithful. Yeah.
Do I remember correctly that you said that changes happened after things were written and they were beginning to be written in Greek? Was there ever anything written in Aramaic?
That's it there. I should have addressed that briefly. You know, when I first arrived at graduate school and met with the person who was to be my advisor, he said, well, Julian, do you have any idea of a dissertation topic? And I said, yes, I do, because I've done a lot of work in Hebrew and some work in Aramaic. I'm interested in the Aramaic tradition of the sayings of Jesus, because there are certain sayings that seem to be translatable back into Aramaic from the Greek that make good sense in Aramaic, and plausibly, and most plausibly, his mother tongue would have been Aramaic. So that's a great question. My advisor, who was a very well-known Jesuit scholar, George McRae, he said, well, Julian, I'd have thought that's a rather dead issue by now. So here was this promising young student, you know, being told, really, I'm still fascinated by the question. There really isn't much there, and it's highly disputed whether this is just wishful thinking. What you do is you take your Greek New Testament, Well, there are a few sayings that are in Aramaic, but that's almost by accident. What you do is you take your Greek New Testament and you try and translate things back into Aramaic, which is not that hard to do, and see if you can find plays on words or other ways that would have made these characteristic of Semitic speech that was perhaps lost in the translation. Let me give you one example that I love. It's my favorite one. You know the parable of the, what is it called, Nancy, where one person, that people are entrusted with money when the master goes away? The talents. And this guy is entrusted with a talent. What did you do with your talent? And one says, I put it in a handkerchief. And the other says, I buried it in the ground. If you translate those two words, these isolated words, but if you translate handkerchief and ground back into Aramaic, it's the same consonantal structure of the word, same word. Now, plausibly, when that saying was handed down, one understood it to mean handkerchief, and the other understood it to mean word. And that's just a tiny example, but it's a real one that really persuaded, well, it didn't persuade me, but it certainly intrigued me. The problem is there aren't many that strong. There's also the problem of, there are some Aramaic words and phrases in the Gospels themselves where Jesus says, Talitha kum, you may remember, he says, young girl, arise, and so on. Even the words from the cross, although they're actually Hebrew, my God, why have you forsaken me? There is a tendency in the tradition to anachronize, that is to deliberately kind of make things sound archaic or ancient. And those are very hard to nail down as being the truth of the truth of the matter. Oh, no. But what we do have are fairly early, a couple of fairly early Hebrew and Syriac translation. The Syriac translation became quite important. But you can't date it earlier than, I think the Syriac translation may be the 3rd century, because there were Syriac-speaking Christians. In fact, the Syriac church, it developed as its own church. You've heard of, I'm sure, St. Ephraim, who wrote in Greek and in Syriac. So there is a strong reception of the Jesus tradition, but I don't think, I think my advisor was probably right in steering me away from the Aramaic stratum, but I remained very interested in it. The fact is, and I saw this with my own eyes, I spent a semester teaching in Gaza, as part of what was the Marquette Gaza program, and so I was surrounded by Arabic speakers, but they could speak pretty good English too. In other words, a bilingual environment, which we're not so familiar with in this country, at least in Wisconsin for sure, where it's most plausible that Jesus spoke Aramaic at home. But when he was teaching, he could easily probably switch between one and the other. Minimally, if he really was a carpenter or had some trade, he could, as is commonly said, he could speak business Greek. You can get by. Just as even the little kids that I used to walk by on my way to the school I was teaching at in Gaza, they knew how to ask for candy in English. In other words, they could converse, they could tell jokes, they could tell me stories about their family. So, and the Gospels are not, generally speaking, not in very sophisticated language, because Jesus taught in down-to-earth figures. So the understanding that he could talk Greek, and we don't have any evidence of Jesus writing anything, apart from the writing on the ground and so on, but other than that, so it seems plausible that Jesus didn't himself write and leave a written legacy. So another question? Yeah.
Could you talk a little bit about the work of Rudolf Bultmann and your reaction or your opinion of his work?
All right. Rudolf Bultmann was one of the giants of the 20th century. Interestingly, he's chiefly remembered today, I can't really say this. He's remembered in two ways. First, as being an immense New Testament scholar, but he really was most challenged in his work originally as an existentialist theologian, because he was believed to have entered the Gospels of any basis other than, an existentialist. That is, the Gospels as being about human self-realization. So he was trying to sort of modernize our understanding of the gospel message. I'm glad you mentioned him because it gives me an excuse to name my own teacher at Harvard. Rudolf Bultmann's last student was Helmut Koester, and Helmut Koester did his PhD at Marburg under Rudolf Bultmann, and I became Helmut Koester's, not exactly his last student, but one of his last students at Harvard. It was Rudolf Bultmann who, in a sense, perfected the method of comparing these. So he wrote this magnificent work, going paragraph by paragraph through the New Testament, showing how each unit of the tradition grew. So that's the Bultmann I know best. Now, the Bultmann that really is still out there and challenging people mostly is the Bultmann of the existentialist philosophy. Are you familiar with that book? Oh, anyway, it's still a giant, but I think, you see, scholarship has really moved on in terms of what it's interested in from those questions to questions of literary comparison to various kinds of, I mentioned these near the end, contextual readings. Contextual readings are where you ask not what did the original author say or mean to say, which is what still engages me first, but to say where is the reader coming from? What is the context of the modern reader? And so now you take, let's say, a very popular kind of subtopic is post-colonial readings. How do we read the New Testament in a post-colonial world, since the New Testament itself was written in a colonial world, written in the Roman colonies? You were part of that system. How do you kind of, I won't say separate the gospel from that, but at least understand, read the gospel in light of that context? So one useful model that is a textbook I have used quite recently for a master's class, breaks down the reading of the New Testament into three things. Behind the text, all the things that fed into it. In the text, that is all the things that are going on in the text as it's written. And then in front of the text, which is the reader. Who is this reader? The feminist reader, the Latin American reader. You can imagine all these different audiences all listening with their ears, because that's what they're perfect right to do. What is the gospel saying to me? And so now these questions of the order of the gospels kind of recede, except I would want to say, please make sure you're listening to the authentic voice here, because often we can separate an earlier voice from a later one.
Just a quick follow-up. It was my understanding that one thing Bultmann was trying to do was to figure out which sayings in the gospel were actually sayings of Jesus and which were inserted later by the scholars.
Yes, absolutely. In fact, he developed criteria, which the kind of criteria used by that Jesus seminar I mentioned, for separating. Generally speaking, there are, I didn't get to list these, but there are a number of principles on which, at least as a working hypothesis, you try to separate the more primitive, as we call it, material, that is, that goes back to Jesus or likely to go back to Jesus, from the later. For example, one of my favorites is the criterion of embarrassment. Would the church have invented this saying, or is this the kind of thing you have in mind? Or was this so tenacious in the tradition that it had to leave it there because it was known, but you therefore had to accommodate it? So, for example, the baptism of Jesus by John. You can tell it's a difficulty because Matthew has to go to such lengths to explain how it can happen. Where John goes up to Jesus and says, well, shouldn't you be baptizing me? And Jesus says, well, this had to happen to fulfill all righteousness and so on. Now, I don't think anyone thinks that exchange goes back to Jesus, but it almost certainly adds evidence to the fact that Jesus was baptized by John. And we know John was baptizing. So if John is baptizing, Jesus goes out to be baptized. The tradition then says, wait a minute, that if Jesus was Son of God, why did John baptize him? And so Matthew answers the question. Similarly, when Jesus is buried and the tomb is sealed with this stone, in Mark, that's it. As soon as the tomb is sealed, and off they all go, and then the following morning they come back. But in Matthew's been thinking about this, or at least been hearing things. And so what happens in Matthew is that Pilate orders, or he has one of the soldiers say, wait a minute, what if the disciples come in the night and take the body? They're going to say that he was raised from the dead. So Matthew solves that problem by having Pilate place a guard in front of the tomb. So the tradition is very responsive, and Bultmann was trying to catch these kind of motivations from within the tradition to enhance, to glorify, to whatever it may be, in some way to make it a smoother story, a more persuasive story. And this goes all the way back. I mean, in every phase of the ministry of Jesus, you can see these motivations of work. Yes?
What's the significance of the order of the Gospels? Matthew, Mark, Luke, John?
Yeah, this is, it's actually not known why. Because it's not, what you'd expect would be from the longest to shortest, which is where the epistles are generally organized. I can't give an answer to that question. Yeah, I just can't. We would expect Matthew to be, well, actually, just a moment. When you say the order, I naturally think of Mark as first. Matthew is first. We know why Matthew is first. That's the easy one, because Matthew became the most copied, most loved, most used gospel. So that one's easy. The question is why the others in the order they're in. That's the question. But Matthew being first, that's easy. Augustine thought Matthew was first. And we need to remember that there weren't complete New Testaments in circulation everywhere for several hundred years, because originally, until the Codex was in general, Codex, meaning the book, was in general use, it was scrolls. And you wouldn't have a scroll, you wouldn't customarily have a scroll of the whole New Testament. It's rather like the Isaiah scroll, which is just massive and would have to take a long, long table to the Isaiah scroll in the Old Testament. It's only with the invention of the Codex you can start putting lots of books together, because you've got all these pages. So that you can then make them almost indefinitely longer.
Yeah, the Moratorian code, the Moratorian, it lists the order of the books. When was that dated from? That?
All right. When I went to college, the Moratorian canon, which is one of the earliest canon lists, the listing of the New Testament books, the New Testament comprises these books. The orthodoxy was that it's from the middle of the 2nd century. So that's still widely circulated. I don't believe that for a minute. And the reason I don't, well, I mean, for a minute I do. But then one of my colleagues and I, Michelle Barnes, recently retired. We used to debate this because he still holds to the early date. But for me, the issue is settled on the question of genre. When do canon lists start to appear? When do people create them? And the canon lists that are most like this Moratorian canon, which is by all means is very important, but very hard to date. It's in Latin, and it's in not very good Latin, and so on and so forth. But we get lists like that in the 4th century. They don't belong in the 2nd century. If it does, it's unusual for something to appear like a flash, and then you don't see it again for another 200 years. Generally, that's not how genres work. Now, admittedly, it takes one good exception. You know, you need one to kind of sustain a rule. But no, I'm much more sympathetic with the view that it's late, it's 4th century.
When did the earliest complete version of the New Testament surface as a document?
Well, probably with the conversion of Constantine and the universalization of the church. We do know that when Constantine was converted, he at once ordered hundreds of copies of the New Testament to be made and to be circulated throughout the empire for use in the churches. You know, until then, it was quite commonly illegal to own scriptures, even churches, not just individuals. So you had to get a certificate. There are plenty surviving in Greek, mainly, some in Latin. They're called libelli, libellus being a kind of certificate or receipt. The soldiers would show up at your door and would say, Mr. Martini, we hear you have a Gospels book here. And you would either say, no Gospels book, never has been, wouldn't think of it. You know, I know that that's not allowed. Or if you had one, you'd hand it over and you'd get this receipt called a libellus. So by the time that the next Roman soldier came along, you could say, look, I've got, the receipt shows that I handed it over. But then from the mid-4th century on, we get copies And of course, then at that point, you do get a tendency towards a more harmonized text. Unfortunately, the mid-4th century text is not the most reliable because it tends to have overlooked differences in particular traditions, those differences that are of great value for those of us who want to get back and see the diversity of it earlier. If you looked at that little Greek New Testament I passed around, you'll have noticed that the bottom 2 inches of every page are devoted to tiny print, Greek. And that's the textual apparatus showing all the variant readings, all the different manuscripts, because scribes copy things differently. They're influenced. They have their own agendas they want to follow. Or they simply misread. They get tired. Sometimes a scribe at the end will say, please forgive the mistakes in this manuscript, but I copied it when I was very tired. Or something of that. And that's understandable. There's one famous one, the Codex Coridaethi, that was copied by a scribe who knew no Greek. But he could copy. You know, Nancy probably knows people in calligraphy who can copy an alphabet they don't really know. And so he just copied this thing. But not surprisingly, there are what he didn't recognize as mistakes. I mean, letters that he miscopied. And sometimes there is some consequence, you know, to someone who doesn't agree.
The theory basically is that Luke and Matthew put together greatest hits of 3 different sources, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Was there ever a serious move to just have one gospel?
Well, yes, as I said before, the idea of a harmony, a gospel harmony. Okay. Towards the late 2nd century, there was a great move. There was, in particular, a church leader in Syria called Tatian. And Tatian's Diatessaron became, really, for a while, might have become the gospel of the church because it harmonizes everything together. You can still find copies if you go online. I don't know if there's an easily accessible one volume, but there are plenty of 19th century harmonies because they became very popular, like children's Bibles, which like to harmonize.
We have time for probably one more question. Does anybody have a burning question?
Yeah.
Hero? Somebody else?
So if you were going to focus your time and energy from a personal perspective on reading and studying, is it fair or unfair to say that Mark, being the origination document, is probably the best place to go?
Yes.
Because other authors take liberty later. Is that fair?
Even Mark probably takes liberties, but we doesn't have his sources. At least we can reconstruct them through form criticism. But yes, start with Mark. Get to know Mark well. Get to know one gospel well. And then you can then read Matthew and say, oh, I remember something like that in Mark, and then you can compare the two. And let me just be clear about the bottom line, which I didn't have time quite to get to. The reason for all of this is not just scholarship for scholarship's sake. It's so that the church can get to know Jesus better, to proclaim Jesus better, and to see what the evangelists were doing when they were proclaiming Jesus. So this is, I know it sounds rather altruistic and probably too lofty, but it's kind of for the sake of the gospel truth. It's kind of trying to get back to who Jesus was. Can we hear the voice of the man? And as I said before, there are some of the current generation, if I can speak biblically and apocalyptically, who won't have any of this, who will say, you can never get behind your sources. You can't, Julian, you're just a wishful thinker. You can't get back to Jesus. I happen to think that there is, to use a wonderful phrase by a 19th century German scholar, there is an irreducible minimum of historical data from what Jesus said and did in the Gospels that we can, using the gifts that God has given us, to get back so we can proclaim a Jesus we know we're standing on a firm foundation. The firm foundation, the starting point, is the crucifixion of Jesus. That data, everything really flows from there as the church begins to proclaim its message and to ask the question, just who was this man? Son of God, that's the starting point. Interestingly, not historical, not the man, but Son of God, but then to reconstruct the life of the man who had preceded, the man who was put to death, who is Son of God and reveals himself to be both. So that's the payoff. The yield is preaching that is based on something. It's not just my interpretation of Matthew. I want to say this about Matthew. There has to be, for me, a continuity between Jesus, the tradition, Matthew, so that I'm proclaiming a message that today I think has a lineage.
Julian, thank you very much. I have to say that the forum committee sometimes wonders what people want to hear and what they don't want to hear, and this is a very smart group of people in this room, and I can say that the Scriveners are going to have to up their dinner conversation. So thank you, and it was a great day.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
You said that oral tradition is probably more accurate than
Well,
the written